Shorter has a reputation of being a friendly church. I joined when I was 19, and I used to track 19 from 91. You get 72 years. So I have been in this church 72 years. I am the chairman of the meddling committee, so I meddle with everything that's going on.
We are celebrating our 150 years of service to the community. This gives an opportunity for the entire city of Franklin, as well as the neighboring community, to join in the celebration of the service and witness that we have been providing for the past 150 years. In 1868, under the leadership of Bishop James Alexander Shorter, organized AME churches throughout the state of Tennessee and particularly here in the city of Franklin.
The AME church had already been in existence, starting in Philadelphia. It had spread across the northern states, through Ohio and Chicago, but it was just starting to make inroads into Nashville and Tennessee, really only after the Civil War. What we need to think about in the context of that was that this was in the years right after the Civil War had ended. Most of the African Americans who were living in Williamson County had been enslaved. They would have been taken to worship with whoever enslaved them. Some of them may have gone to church at the Episcopal Church, where I go, which is how I actually first got interested in researching Shorter's history. And I was researching our history and started finding references to enslaved people being baptized at St. Paul's Episcopal Church and a funeral being conducted by one of our priests. And I wanted to know more about who these people were and where they went when the Civil War ended. I think that's something that a lot of people don't realize, that most of the population at that time were African American here in Williamson County. Shorter Chapel was formed was organized in 1868, just 3 years after the end of the Civil War. And then by April of 1872, just about 4 years later, those early parishioners had saved up $1,500, which was a lot of money, and they bought the building that had belonged to the White Methodist Church. And it was where today's brownstones are in downtown Franklin. It's on the corner of 2nd Avenue and Church Street. And it was a very big, very impressive building. It was like 2.5 stories tall, but it had been heavily damaged during the Civil War. And so it was like a fixer-upper when they bought it. Newspaper articles talk about how they very quickly had an organ and a choir. So they were very organized.
Shorter Chapel fits into the history of Franklin being the first African Methodist Episcopal Church. And it has played a major role in the black community in Franklin. In my study of Williamson County history, and particularly the African Americans' contribution to that history, and when you look at the membership of those members of Shorter Chapel, it's very easy to determine they were leaders in the black community in Franklin. It seemed to be the church where your doctors came from. We had Dr. Johnson, Dr. Hudson. It's where your teachers came from.
A long time ago, this is a professional church, We had doctors and we had nurses and we had teachers, and they were not snooty, if that's a good word. They were just Christian people, and they just helped anybody who needed help. So, Shorter, I think, has a very good reputation here.
And what makes us different from other churches in this area is that we are known as the Church of Social Justice, the Church of Protest, or when it was formed 100 years ago, the Abolition Church.
Our denomination was formed in large measure for protection as well as for protest. For protection in the sense that it gave an opportunity for people of like mind to have support, but also for protest that those who did not acknowledge our humanity have to reckon with our humanity, and together we make that witness.
We know that in July of 1868, there was a series of lynchings right here in Franklin. And then in August of 1868, Shorter Chapel was formed. So that's sort of the backdrop against which these early parishioners decide to organize their own church. And I always think about it as like they were really creating a sanctuary. You know, we think of a sanctuary as being a church building, but they were really creating their own sanctuary by coming together and trying to create safety, a place of peace, and a place where they could worship together. The church stayed at that location and in that building from the 1870s until 1925. And in December of 1924, they negotiated to swap the old church building for an empty lot on Natchez Street. Lots and lots of sort of oral history exists to the fact that the building was torn down brick by brick and carried over here to Folk Street and Natchez Street and rebuilt. The story is that they tore the church down and they had like a parade, and people carried the bricks by hand. They had them in wheelbarrows and in carts. It's a beautiful story about that time and how they wanted to stay tied to the past.
I think the leaders of this church, of Shorter Chapel, were very smart in looking at the future and saying, we need to be in the heart of the black community. And so they chose this site, which is right in the middle of the Natchez Street community.
When we started looking at the building and comparing it to photographs of the original Shorter Chapel sanctuary, we realized that not only did they carry the bricks, they carried these beautiful stained glass windows with them. There's a cornerstone at the northeast corner of the church that I think was probably laid when the building was reconstructed in 1925. So I suspect there's a time capsule in the corner of the church, in the cornerstone.
We have one picture that was taken out here in front. There was a convention here of the Mosaic Society, which one of its members had them meet here, and the whole street is full of people. Hundreds of people coming from across Tennessee to meet here. That's really the first photograph we have of this church after it had moved to Natchez Street and Folk Street.
Shorter Chapel is important in the history of the church because it represents a part of our legacy in terms of what we have stood for, and as well as what we've evolved to be. What you see is a place today that represents over 7 generations. These children and grandchildren, but for me, I have to go back to my great-grandfather to be in the generation represented at the founding of Shorter. It says that following the Civil War, when people did not have to worship because they were not compelled by a master or by even by a community, people had a desire to worship God, be in community, and to be supportive of each other and of family. And so as that legacy continues, it makes Shorter an important part of who we are and who we are becoming. The church is relevant today because God has not gone anyplace. And so for people to have a relationship with God is important.
On these matters of social justice, Shorter Chapel takes the lead and the leadership here in the city of Franklin. For example, recently, a couple of years ago, when the Charleston Nine were murdered at Emmanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina, Shorter Chapel provided the leadership in having a prayer vigil here, which all the churches in the city as well as the city leadership participated in to bring about healing and race conciliation in the community. We conducted with First Presbyterian Church in the city and other churches a series of workshops where the two congregations came together to discuss matters of race. And so our church is very involved in bringing about racial conciliation here in the city of Franklin.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, we dedicate this sign.
It is with heartfelt thanksgiving that the late Mr. Lewis Lester, we give God the glory for his unwavering commitment and generosity.
Let us all pray now as Jesus taught the disciples, saying, Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory forever. Amen.
The 150th anniversary celebration is the sesquicentennial of the organization of this church.
Our primary goal is to reintroduce ourselves to the community, not only just to Franklin, but pretty much to all of Middle Tennessee, just to let them know that Shorter Chapel is here, not only in a church capacity, but we're also your friends, we're your neighbors. So anything that you may need, that our doors are always open. That's a way for us to get out, to visit with our local neighbors, to hopefully bring in members or members that we have lost in the past, to let them know that we're still here, we still love them if they need anything.
We are engaged in restoration, and restoration in three parts. Restoration of our people's relationship to God through prayer, through religious education, and through our community involvement. We are restoring our relationship to restoring our facility. And so we have a historic property that has great community value, and our bell tower, as well as other aspects of this facility need to maintenance and upgrading. And so to preserve this property for another 150 years, we are celebrating the accomplishments, not only of the past, but also looking towards the future to make certain that we are around for another 150 years. One of our accomplishments has been we have a Feed the Community program where every summer we feed 400 families for the summer, every day at our Community Life Center. So that's meeting the needs of feeding the poor in this community.
Right now, the Missionary Society really has a program. It's called Comfort and Joy. I always get it mixed up. But we're planning to give clothes, coats to children in schools who hadn't gotten any. And we said that they would have the comfort, and we get the joy of knowing that we have done that. We make ourselves a part of the community. We're just not sitting here doing nothing, but we are a community church. If we find out that there's somebody in the community that needs help, then sure that it helps them, We used to have a lot of children, and they grow up like you folk do. But the one thing I'm proud of is the new program that we started is the Children's Church. We nurture children. We really do, and we nurture old folk too. And I wouldn't take anything for being a short out.